Welcome to the typical now Thursday night mass participation world webinar series in fundamentally focusing on the new normal. Delighted today to be joined by an esteemed panel to talk about the new normal. What insurance considerations do you need? I'm Robb, for those of you that don't know me, the CEO and founder of Mass Participation World. Thanks for joining us from wherever you are around the world. We've had people from literally all over the place signing up for this, which is fantastic. Obviously pretty topical at the moment. What I'm going to do just quickly before I introduce our panelists, I'm going to just launch a poll, which I do most weeks now, just to give us a little bit of a sense of who's on the call and listening in. And whilst we do that, just love to welcome Nash, who's the Managing Director of Sportscover, tuning in from very cold Melbourne. I think if it's anything like it was yesterday when we had our planning call. Not quite as rugged up as you were when you came in from footy training last night, Chris, but thanks for joining us.
Yeah. A little bit warmer today, but not a lot.
All right, well, good that it's a bit warmer. Thanks for coming in to join us. Frankie Hernandez, the Entertainment Manager Overseas General Insurance from Chubb, joining us from London.
Hi, thanks, Chris. Hi, everybody.
Thank you. Thanks, Jack Caress, Director of Caress Insurance Agency, long-time veteran of the mass participation industry, based out of LA, but joining us from Cleveland today. Hi, Jack. Good to see you.
Good morning from Cleveland, 6 a.m. here.
Early in the morning for you. And Stuart Barclay, Sales Director of Protect Group, joining us from Leeds in the United Kingdom. Hi there, Stuart.
Hi everyone.
Thanks for joining. So we'll just quickly end that poll and pop it in as expected. Predominantly people here from the mass participation industry sector. I'll just share those results. A few people in the corporate world and a few in the other space. So just a little bit of quick housekeeping before we get underway. Please, if you wouldn't mind, stay on mute so we don't get a whole bunch of feedback during the course of the call. We are recording. We're also live on Facebook, so this will be published on the Mass Participation World YouTube channel within a couple of days, and it will obviously stay on the Mass Participation World Facebook page for if you want to share it with any friends or colleagues who might have missed it. And just as always, just touch on a couple of the other initiatives which I have running. Every week I do a strength in numbers call, which we've typically been running 2 time slots for, 8:30 a.m. Singapore time, 4:30 p.m. Singapore time. What I'm going to be doing next week, I'm just getting a little bit of time pressures, and also my son has just returned to school, so the 8:30 slots become pretty difficult for me. So we're going to move that to one combined slot, 4:30 p.m. Singapore. I know that becomes a little bit challenging for our American colleagues, but we're going to stick to that one for the time being. I also have been running now for 8 weeks. It's absolutely flown by, an initiative called the Aid Station, which is interviewing people from all over the world in our industry, 15 to 18-minute interviews, which I pre-record on Zoom. They get published every day on various channels during the week. Tomorrow we will publish edition 40. Had an amazing week this week. We had Robb Australian marathon legend, former world record holder, and an incredible lady, Blanche Moyler, out of South Africa. Blanche was the first black woman to be allowed to represent South Africa. She's got an incredible story. They're all posted on the Mass Participation World YouTube channel, and I generally launch them each day on the Facebook page and on my LinkedIn page. So anybody who's interested and very interested to hear of people that might be suitable to or interesting people to be interviewed. It's not all about industry leaders. We've had Andrew Messick, we've had Joe DeSena. We're hoping to have a number of other high-profile people in the industry, John Ridgen in the next couple of weeks, but it's also about lots of ordinary people that make up our industry, so I'd love to hear any inspirational stories around that. Then these masterclasses every Thursday at roughly this time, depending on where the panelists are coming from. Next week we have a panel on registration, so what do registration platforms need to look like? What are some of the different initiatives that might be taken around that? The following week, a really exciting one. There's lots of alliances that are starting to pop up around the world in terms of bringing the industry together, and I'm hoping to bring a number of those alliances to the webinar to hear what they're saying, so that we can hopefully promote more global collaboration on some of the things that we're doing to try and fast track the industry coming back to having events on, albeit safely, as the key priority. And then we're looking to do sponsorship and content creation and a number of other things in the coming weeks. So if there's anything I can help with, if you need any of those recordings or whatever, please feel free to email me directly, chris@chrisrobb.asia, or connect with me on LinkedIn or Facebook. And just before I go now through what we're going to go through over the next 50 minutes or so, I'm just going to quickly shoot another poll in there to give us a little bit of a sense of what services within the sectors we're in we provide, which gives us a bit of a sense. My sense is we're probably talking to a lot of event organizers tonight, but if you wouldn't mind jumping on that. So over the next sort of 50 minutes or so, we've allocated an hour. We're going to cover about 7 key areas. We welcome questions in the Q&A and the chat box. Please feel free. I'll try and monitor those as we go through and bring them to the panelists. We're going to talk about what insurers might be looking for from a risk management requirements perspective to deliver COVID-safe events. We're going to talk about gathering of personal information, what may be required and adequate from an insurance perspective. We're going to talk about insurance as a marketing tool and give Stuart the opportunity to talk a little bit about some of the products that his group has in terms of entry fee protection and so on, which hopefully gives participants the confidence to be able to say, hey, well, if we sign up for one of those events and it doesn't take place, at least we're not completely risking our shirts in terms of our entry fee. We're going to talk a little bit about virtual events. They're popping up all over the place. I don't think it's going to be a super long conversation, but just get some insights from the panel in terms of what insurance, if any, they feel may be required for those. We're going to talk about assumed risk. We're going to talk a little bit about legal jurisdictions and how this may vary from country to country and territory to territory within countries. And then I guess the question that's on many people's mind is, what's the budget impact likely to be as we come out of this? What's going to happen with insurance premiums? So why don't we maybe start and jump across to Chris in Australia. And Chris, maybe just get your sense, if you wouldn't mind, in terms of some of the risk management requirements that insurers are going to be looking for as we moved out of this.
Yeah, well, I think, thanks, Chris. I think the first thing is that insurers are going to be looking for a risk management plan to deal with COVID and how the event manager is actually coping with that. I think that's going to be really important in terms of how that's displayed to the underwriter, because that's going to be one of the key factors as to, firstly, whether the underwriter is prepared to take on the risk, and then secondly, whether there's going to be all sorts of terms and conditions applied to that. One thing I wanted to say up front is that from what I've picked up over the last probably 3 or 4 weeks, different seminars I've been involved with, the plans that are being made now should be considered as though they are actual changes to the operation of the event or the business. They're not things that you should be thinking in terms of, okay, we'll put this in place and, within a couple of months we won't have to do it, so we don't really need to put that much time and effort into it. I think it's really clear to me, especially from some of the stuff that I've seen in the last week or so. A seminar I was involved with the head doctor at the Australian Institute of Sport, and he talked about the second and third wave, and he made the point that the corona group of viruses we've been trying to find a vaccine for, since day dot. We haven't done that yet, and they've been around for as long as we can remember. So don't be surprised if this thing continues on for 12 months, 18 months, 2 years, using SARS as the example, where we've still taking ages to get that one sorted. So the changes I think that people should be considering need to be permanent changes that they're going to be able to roll out time and time again. So they need some serious thought. And it's going to be everything from distancing through the kind of event that you've got and how can you manage that, through the sanitation, which is a really interesting one. And I'm not sure that anybody genuinely knows the answer to that as we sit now. I think it's going to be one of those ones where you need to partner up with your insurer and understand what you're doing and then work through the process of how you can, get the best results moving forward.
That's great insights, thanks. And your comment at the end there, partner up with your insurer. I think one of the common themes around this whole COVID-19 is collaboration, communication is key. Whether it be with government, whether it be within the industry, it's no longer the case of just putting in a plan and assuming that someone sits in a room and ticks it off and comes back. There's going to be a lot of dialogue that's going to happen, isn't it?
Absolutely.
Sorry, Chris. I think mentioning the government actually. Chris, is fundamental because each jurisdiction does have a different sort of way of looking at things from a health and safety aspect.
Yeah.
So that in conjunction with the event management plan is absolutely key in terms of what they require from an insurance perspective and how the risk is viewed.
Yeah.
So.
And I think it also the reason I say partner up, because this particular subject matter, as we discussed yesterday, I mean, it's got mass participation in the title. There'll be a number of underwriters who immediately you bring up the term mass participation, they're out straight away. They're not interested and off they go. They don't want to know. So I think in the initial stages of this, the group of insurers that will be able to take this on are going to be a lot smaller than would have been in January.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I mean, you mentioned yesterday that you said it's not inconceivable that the term that you use, going to be some black holes where there'll be certain areas where, due to, and we're going to talk a little bit about, legal jurisdiction, but there may just be insurers that say that the risk in that particular jurisdiction is going to be so high that we're not prepared to give cover. Yeah,
well, I'm sure Jack can fill us in a bit more, but I've heard that there's 8 states in the US who have currently taken on the position that they will effectively roll back the clock and include the pandemic cover in business interruption policies and the like. So that that's going to be one for insurers where they're constantly saying, okay, well, I don't want to play in that jurisdiction, so I'll go somewhere else, and that's going to make it difficult.
Thoughts on that, Jack?
I think he's actually right. As you and I were talking about yesterday, Chris, there's the insurance commissioners that have the right in each state in the United States to be able to essentially retroactively alter insurance policies, which means in the future, insurers are not going to be interested in covering these particular areas. It hasn't so much happened because the events have all essentially stopped. There really aren't any events in the United States right now, but in the future, why would they want to grant insurance in that area? And I think any place that's got a major city right now, I haven't seen any guidelines that they're not even addressing it. It's not even on the table yet in places like Los Angeles, certainly not New York. And given what's going on in the country right now, I think it's going to be an extremely difficult environment, at least for 2020, maybe 2021. Yeah. And this is where we got into that discussion we had about assumed risk and what are the athletes going to be willing to sign in terms of waivers and whether those are going to be something that the governmental permitting agencies are willing to accept, and what are those going to look like? And I forgot who said it at the beginning, but I think you almost have to eliminate the term mass participation, and you have to completely rethink the events and how they're going to be constructed. That's going to be acceptable, first of all, to what's going to allow you to get a permit of any type, and then how you can cover the participants and also make it something they want to do, and considering the risks or perceived risks, as the way I'd put it.
Yeah.
And you've also got to turn a profit out of all of that as well. I mean, people aren't going to do it for nothing. So yeah, that's going to be the difficult part. But that's going to be a partnership. I think you're going to need to get all sides involved.
Well, Chris, I think what this has exposed, and there's not very many publicly traded companies, but the few that you can look at that have had IPOs or publicly traded, and at least some of their operations are publicly traded. Many of these companies have been putting on participant sporting events, not making a profit.
Yeah.
And it's not to say that you look at Ironman or Lifetime or in the United States-based companies, and now it's getting into the services like the transaction takers. Eventbrite is publicly traded. I mean, it's just it's a bad scenario. So what does it look like going forward with profit? How's that going to look, and what are people willing to pay? Anyway, I'm getting off topic.
You do have the element. The whole point of the events, well, not the whole point, but one of the main points is that you generate revenue, and the different forms of revenue, and then you have to pay some. In some of the sporting events, you've got to pay the athletes. Well, the athletes actually earn a living.
Right.
That's got to carry on in some way, shape, or form. You're not just going to be able to stop. Event organisers will have to find a way to host events where they can still generate revenue to be able to pay these athletes or these sportsmen and women to actually participate. I guess the form of revenue generation will change. The form of viewing these events will change. You won't have live crowds. Things will be played behind closed doors. Television broadcasting revenue will become a key component, more so than it already is, even though it generates a huge amount of revenue for the sporting industry. But sponsorship, and then subscribing to watch these things online. The virtual side, I think Chris alluded to that in one of the topics, that they're all it's the way we host these events. It's how they're actually going to go ahead. I think you can have mass participation events. Marathons can take place. You've just got to change the way you do it, in my eyes.
Yeah, and look, things are starting to open up. New Zealand announced today that that they're rolling back, and the indication is that there's going to be mass participation events in June. I think there's some indications in Northern Territory in Australia that that's going to happen. I was talking to someone from Vietnam today. They're talking about events happening there in August. So I think there's going to be different things across the globe where they'll start coming back, but some territories are going to be tougher than others. Speaking about revenue, why don't we give you an opportunity to come into the conversation there, Stuart? So, one of your products is, protecting entry fees, and that's obviously in the mass space, which is the core focus today. That's absolutely crucial as one of the revenue streams. And, one of the reasons, as Jack would well know, that, the industry is on its knees right now is that, many people live from hand to mouth in this industry. Cash flows are hugely challenging. Margins are tiny. And now all of a sudden the merry-go-round has stopped and people are having to hand back entry fees, and many of them are just not in a position to do that. So the virtual events have been created as a substitute for the real event. And maybe just talk a little bit about it. I kind of bracket it as a marketing opportunity as we move forward to give, let's assume that we're down the track and things are back to some kind of a new normal and events are happening. But the kind of peace of mind for participants to know that, if an event gets cancelled, whether it's COVID or something else, and, recognize we've got a big focus here on COVID, but as we move forward, this probably changes the shape of insurance considerations across different categories. It's not just, communicable diseases and cancellations, but it's kind of waking the small businesses that run these events up to say, do I have the right kind of insurance portfolio that's covering my business?
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think the important thing is event cancellation insurance is one of the products that we have, but pandemic won't be available widely. Pandemic cover won't be available widely. I'm asked about it every day. And I think the reality is people need to look past that a bit, look beyond that, because any pandemic cover won't protect COVID-19, in my opinion. You'd be talking ridiculous rates for that. So I would try and look beyond that, but still protect the event against cancellation. Because if people are protected against cancellation, then they're more likely to buy those entries, in my opinion. And the way our event cancellation products work is they're embedded into the cost of the registration. So it becomes cost neutral to the event organizers. So, a big part of why I'm on is to get our name to you guys, so you can give us a call to discuss that further. I'm not going to give a full sales pitch on the webinar, but event cancellation insurance will definitely get people interested in registering again, even if that's for 2021. And our other product is to protect individuals who book a registration who then can't attend the event. And again, that's also really, really important at this time, because we do cover injury, we do cover illness. And if you're registering for an event in 2021, it could even be 12 months away from now when you're registering, you could become injured between now and then, and we will refund the participants. So both are, I think, will really increase confidence in people booking those registrations again. And both, if you reach out to me, we'll be able to explain how they can also generate revenue for your businesses. At a time when revenue is needed, we're wondering, will event prices go up, or are we already at a ceiling? You know, how are you all going to generate that revenue? So I think event cancellation and participation protection, when they're buying those registrations, are both really important. And I think the new normal is, in my opinion, is what the webinar is called. I think it is the old normal. I think people do need to look beyond communicable disease, because I just don't think it will be good value for money. I know that Frank has got views on it.
Well, sure. To add to that, yeah, I've been looking at some stats, you know, and I'm interested to see how people are thinking about going back to the new normal once sort of lockdown rules and legislations are sort of reduced. And there have been some interesting polls out there. One that actual Polestar actually put together with Fest Ticket, and they asked 110,000 festival goers. After lockdown is kind of reduced, or you know, lockdown doesn't really exist. It's just the new norm. How many of the 110,000 people would actually be happy to go to a festival in 1 to 6 months following that lockdown kind of release? And I was really surprised. It was 82% of that 110,000 people. That's a big percentage. So I think people want to go to these events.
Yeah.
They do want to attend them.
I think we discussed it a little bit last night on the planning. It's a conversation I've had multiple times. You just anecdotally look at what's happening in communities on a day-to-day basis. As you know, people seem desperate to get back to life, and in some instances seem almost oblivious to risk. You know, beaches open and people are cheek by jowl on the beaches. People are queuing up in hardware stores when the sun's out in England and pouring into them. And I think, you know, there's that desire to get back, but we as an industry need to make people feel safe that, you know, the cover's in place, the plans are in place, the collaborations happened in place, to make them feel confident in an event.
Well, Chris, if we call it a protest, we could probably do it right now.
Yeah, I know. Yeah.
That seems to have violated every rule that was set down the last 6 months.
Yeah, and right across.
I have a cynical sense of humor.
Yeah, no, yeah. It's all right.
I do. I mean, I am. You know, I know, Stuart, you said that pandemic cover won't be available, but you know, we have the capability to offer communicable disease cover. We probably won't be offering COVID-19 cover right at this particular time, but communicable disease cover, I think you will be able to get it. It's not going to be a traditional kind of just inclusion, which it seems to have been over the years. You know, it all stems it all stems back to whatever reinsurers are prepared to allow insurance companies to protect. And I think, it's a systemic loss. So now the insurance companies will be looking at their net capabilities, and some will offer it. We can offer it.
I think it's more the value for money, Frankie. If I'm perfectly,
I'm sure.
I think
Exactly.
it
It's not going to be cheap.
It's
not going to be cheap. Obviously.
Yeah, I don't see many people being able to fit it within their budget. I mean, at Protect Group, we are looking at a event cancellation product which includes it. Amongst other elements which are generally excluded from event cancellation, we're looking at a more rounded product to come out of this situation with. But if I'm honest with you, it will be significantly more expensive than the one that we offer today. And it again will come back down to choice. And
I think over time, Stuart, we'll get the governments will start getting involved with pools. It's already happening. The discussions are taking place in certain territories. We're certainly seeing it with the film industry. The governments are trying to help. That will start to happen. The pools will start to appear, and a bit like the terrorism kind of TRIA Act and the Pool Re and the other terrorism pools that are around the world. The same kind of thing I think will happen for communicable disease. I think it has to. The governments have to step in. I mean, they've already stepped in, across the globe. The economic impact, they've had to step in. They've had no choice. And I think that will become a way of life. It'll be really interesting to see what each sort of territory does in terms of government aid.
Yeah, it's a great point, and
I think that in the United States anyway, I'm not seeing much government aid coming to participation sports anytime soon. And I think the model that Chris and I have discussed offline about Spartan putting on an event, I wasn't even aware of it in Florida, and it's on private property. And I think that frankly is going to be an important factor. I'm concerned, and I don't mean to sound like the downer here, but that public agencies, having worked with major cities across the United States and almost every market over the years, they're the ones that are going to dictate the insurance requirements, however obscene and crazy they might be. They're going to, all the insurance I've ever had to purchase or help people with has been usually because of a requirement from a government a permitting agency, private or public, in most cases public, telling me what I had to have, whether I wanted it or not. And I think it's going to be very profound and outrageous what the cost is going to be. So the alternatives are privately owned, off-site, not public areas where you can have a little more latitude on what the terms are, and also what you can expect from the athlete. And I go back to this. Chris and I met when I was putting on a project that was in all over the world, I should say, with a running event with Dow Chemical. And there were a number of countries I found, surprisingly, that had assumed risk as part of their structure of events. And you couldn't sue event organizers because it wasn't legally possible. That if you're going to do an event like a triathlon or an obstacle race or a marathon, that you assume some risk in doing so, and made it very difficult to blame, if you get a virus or something else, you knew that was a possibility getting into the event. How is that going to be factored into people's perception in the future? And going back, I'm watching in real time here in the United States. I'm not sure how much it's going on. I've been focusing on the U.S. lately, but the people are certainly willing to gather in large groups without concerning themselves for what was an apparent risk a week ago. So are people going to be willing to say, you know what, I'll sign the waiver that tells me, I'm good with whatever insurance is being offered, and I just want to do this event with my friends and family, and that's my problem. Anyway,
so how do you balance that out then with duty of care with the organizers to be in a position that if something happens, so you can say, okay, well, we circumvent this by going to a private venue. We don't need the cover, But if the proverbial happens, then you've got a situation where the organizer is exposed and the participant is exposed. So, and I guess what you're saying is there's got to be some kind of a balance there where, you know, the onus is on event organizers to have some degree of duty of care, but also it means that it's practical for the events to happen without onerous premiums.
Well, that's a great. I think you have to be in partnership with the insurance companies and also major medical providers and health plans are willing to jump into this because they're looking to sponsor things. I mean, in the United States, United Healthcare they already have sponsored some golf tournaments that they weren't before. I think they're going to be looking for potential relationships that they weren't before because they see this as an opportunity to promote their healthcare and health plan products. So to me,
So
that's
just a question around that. Thanks, Jack. There's Manfred from Joburg's put it in here. Surely, if the events are held on private properties and there is insurance, the insurance companies will still dictate the policies and prices.
Absolutely.
They tend not to be as robust as the governmental agencies in my history, but the others can weigh in on that.
Chris, what's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think what Jack's saying is that you're more likely to get someone who's entrepreneurial within an insurance organisation than you are in a government agency. I mean, just by their very nature, government agencies are ultra conservative. And so they're going to try and take everything to the nth degree. Now, in our current situation, what does that really mean? Well, it means that they're going to be extremely difficult to deal with. And they would much prefer to say no than say yes. And I think that will exist for a period of time. And it's going to be different in different jurisdictions because, you know, take the US, where the numbers are horrendous in terms of the virus. As Jack mentioned, we've now got the protests and all the concern around the amount of people who aren't wearing masks, who are side by side in the protests, whether they're lying down next to each other on a bridge or they're you know, walking arm in arm down the road, not following the social distancing measures. From what we can see everywhere else in the world, surely that just creates hotspots within the virus because it is so good at spreading quickly. So I think, you know, the situation you may find in the US is probably not going to be the situation that you'll find in New Zealand, where you'll be able to potentially get some help and assistance, and, you know, they'll talk you through it because they're more concerned about, you know, the next cruise ship turning up with potentially 3,000 carriers, as opposed to people who are, you know, going to join in for a, you know, whatever it is, a fun run or a multi-event or whatever it's going to be.
Thoughts on that, Frankie?
I think territorially, it is going to make a huge difference. You know, just how you see the spread of this disease alone, you know, you've got places like Sweden that didn't actually have a lockdown. Yeah, they controlled it because people realised and acted sensibly. I mean, you can read. I read. You know, we're all reading about this every day. And you have optimistic scientists and professors, and you have pessimistic scientists and professors.
Yeah,
and
which one are you,
depending what you read, you know, when we had our conversation prior to this, us as a group, you know, Chris kind of gave me a moment of real doom and gloom when he mentioned the phrase third wave, and I'm thinking, geez, we haven't even, you know, started really. The second wave hasn't kind of, and then I read some Twitter messages and I just think, well, you know, numbers are down in a lot of places, hospitalization numbers, deaths, contraction, you know, it's I don't know. I mean, look, the world has changed. There's no doubt about it, and it isn't going to go back to what it was in January. Period. It's going to have changed forever. So now, you know, event management and event organisers have to move with that. And I think, you know, I've read lots of stuff. The Event Safety Alliance put a really good little paper together on how to try and start getting events moving again. And there's a lot of people in the event industry, probably some people on this webinar, who contributed to that. And it's things like that when you start reading stuff, people trying to put these events on, how they're going to do it, this is going to happen again. And I think there are too many livelihoods, and there is too much of an economic impact for there not to be a solution. So I'm definitely a half glass full guy.
Great to hear.
So,
great to have you on the call. And yeah, obviously, and I think we've been speaking a little bit about the narrative here as well, as it goes, what these events contribute to communities that we need to get governments on board with. It's not typically we've measured social impact of tourists coming in, but what so often, in my opinion, gets overlooked in the narrative is the health and social impact that they create. And
I agree.
You made a point earlier about governments having to support these. It's already starting to be documented, the massive mental health issues that are coming out of this, and the other challenges that we're going to have. So somehow I'm with you that I sense there's going to be some middle ground, and there needs to be some practical solutions. But absolutely, it's come up here many times. It's going to vary so much from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, and some people are going to win and some people are going to lose, I'm
a great believer from an insurance perspective. I'm a great believer in talking to the event organisers, not just having the broker as a conduit. And I think it's a tripartite kind of thing. And I really do think talking to the event organisers and trying to understand their issues and their problems, and it really does help you from an insurer perspective. And then explaining, the issues from an insurer perspective to the event organizer. We're talking to some mass participation organisers, and they're finding ways to be able to try and get these events going. And it's to do with mental well-being and health, as well as the economic standpoint. And
So can I ask just quickly before I come back to you, Chris? So you mentioned you're a glass half full, and Chris was talking last night about third wave. Where does the industry take its lead from, though, in that perspective? So when you're looking at what you're prepared to underwrite, you obviously you made the point that you like to sit down with event organisers, understand, but ultimately someone makes a decision. And does it tend to swing towards the conservative side of the pendulum, or it's going to vary from underwriter to underwriter?
It varies from risk to risk, from company to company. Absolutely. There will always, this is a very subjective class of insurance. There is no absolutely black and white way of doing this insurance. So, everybody has an opinion. You can't say that any of them are all wrong or all right. It's about appetite. It's about understanding. We deal with some really, really good event organisers, and you know instantly when you're talking to them that they have a plan, that they know how they're going to try and put an event on. And if you get that feeling, you can work with them. If you're talking to event organisers, it's quite clear that they've not got the experience, or they're, I think they're going to disappear. They're not going to be able to get these events insured, which probably means they can't actually take place. They can't get their permits. I think the good organisations will come through this, hopefully, if they can withstand the financial difficulties that obviously everybody's facing. I think the good event organisers will come through this.
Yeah, look, there's a theme that's repeated again. Communication, collaboration, good plans, whether you're talking to your insurer or whether you're talking to the government permitting agency, and again, recognising that it's going to vary from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. Sorry, Chris, I cut you off there. You were going to say something?
Oh, no, I was just going to say on the mental health issue, there's a really interesting thing happening down here at the moment. The government have just poured, I can't remember the amount, but it's I think it's in the up over $100 million into mental health services, because the consideration down here is that based on the unemployment situation that's coming about because of the recession and everything that's been created by the pandemic, we'll actually have more deaths from suicide and mental health issues than we will from the pandemic. Bear in mind, we've only got just over 100 on the pandemic side, and not a whole heap of active cases at the moment. But there's definitely a real understanding that everything else that's gone along with lockdown, and then the upcoming, I guess, wave of unemployment across the world because of, you know, businesses shutting down and so on and so forth, that there is going to be a real issue on the mental health side. And I guess, you know, the mass participation events can help brighten up that aspect.
Yeah, thanks for that. Can I come? You were talking about a plan, and you know, one of the elements of that which we touched on last night is, you know, gathering of personal information to understand, you know, particularly in the early time, you know, where people have gone, who they've interacted with. As an insurer, how crucial is that to the plan, and what kind of information would you be expecting event organisers to provide to you if they were coming to get a policy underwritten?
Yeah, so it really comes down to this whole, I guess, public health position. So one of the things that's happened in cafes right across Australia at the moment is that they will only do seated service, and if you've got seated service, you have to put your name and contact details down in a book to say that you have been here on a particular day for a certain period of time. I can see that that is also something that will potentially need to happen on the event side as well, because if, you know, the 2 or 3 days later somebody within that event has now tested positive to having the virus, well, then there's a whole heap of people who need to be notified, but it may not need to be all of the people, depending on how the event's being run and, you know, whether it's being done in waves or how the thing is being put together. So it's then really about the collection of that information, and then how long do you need to hold that information from the medical standpoint, that if you do have someone get in touch and say, hey, by the way, you know, I've now tested positive, you better tell everyone who was there from this hour to this hour that there's a potential chance that they could have it too. That's going to be the next interesting part. So building that on to include how we will now consider that from an insurance point of view. Obviously, we've always wanted people to take the information anyway, but certainly from a general liability perspective, that will be a really interesting test case in different jurisdictions across the world as to whether you can actually genuinely be liable for transmission, potential transmission, or can you even identify the transmission occurred at an event, and therefore the event organiser holds some sort of negligence. This is going to be completely uncharted territory, and, you know, we're moving into it. Where we go to from here, I don't really know, but we need to be preparing that at some point somewhere someone's going to try that on.
You cited an example last night around HIV. Do you want to maybe just touch on that one? I mean, there's similar parallel there.
Yeah. So, I mean, HIV way back in the early 90s when all the scare was going on was a really interesting one out here in Australia, because we had an Australian rules football player who put his hand up and said, I'm HIV positive, just playing local footy, but I want to continue playing. And then the league was really caught in this unreal position of effectively discriminating against that individual and saying, we don't give you a license to play, or potentially discriminating against the other players, because the fear at the time was that the virus could be transferred in a number of different ways. This is the HIV virus. And you need to cast your mind back to the early 90s and the real fear that was going around. And at that stage, there had been a second strand of the virus talked about that was surviving outside the body for more than 24 hours. And so what ended up coming out of that is what we see right across the world now, which is the blood rule. And the blood rule effectively now started, instead of the trainer coming out with the old towel that he's had for 15 years and has only washed 3 times, instead of that coming out to, wipe someone's brow where they've been split open or whatever, we now had rubber gloves. We were taking players from the field. We were not putting, we were trying to clean up blood spillages, and we had this whole protocol that had come around the blood. Whereas prior to that, it was actually a badge of honour to have, the blood streaming down your face, and you'd wear it all match, and, your jumper was covered in blood. And that was all part of playing rugby, Aussie rules footy, all of those contact sports. It was just one of those things you did. You don't see that these days because of that transformation that took place. And I think we're going to go through the same process again with this virus, trying to get to what that new normal is going to be by finding new ways to deal with how we can effectively work our way around not risking participants, officials, volunteers, with regards to the way that the potential of the virus is treated. I don't know. I mean, I see you go into various places now, and you've got to have the heat check, which they've been doing in China for, I think since last year. So let's think about, I don't know, a triathlon, for example, or event. You do it on a private property, as Jack was saying. So to get through the gate, do you have to pass through a heat check?
Yep.
And if you fail the heat check, then you don't come through the gate. Whether you've paid or not paid, it doesn't matter. You're actually rejected. And how does that scene now look? Do you have people who are saying, no, it's not right. I've been sitting in a warm car for the last 2 hours, and do it again? And do they start to get punchy at the front gate? And do you need to have security to stop them coming onto private property because they've been training for 3 months to do this particular event, or all their mates are going through but they can't go through? All of that sort of stuff. And what happens if, let's say, that a group have travelled in a car and they've come together as a group, and one of them has the temperature check go off? Do you then reject the whole group and not let them into the event? How are we managing these things now? So these are all the questions that are going to come up. And from an insurance perspective, as an underwriter, I'm really, really interested to know and understand how that's going to be handled. And does it change the look of what's going to happen? Are we going to have a situation where somebody actually sneaks into the event after being rejected at the front door? Similar to a nightclub. I know Frankie sneaks into nightclubs all the time. But is it going to be that sort of scenario where we're, security have knocked them back at the front gate, but they find another way in, and then they mingle in amongst the crowd, and then so they officially aren't registered, but then all of a sudden we find out 5 days later that person was actually tested positive.
Chris, I think from a casualty perspective, if you've implemented, the temperature checks, the tracing mechanisms, as much health and safety as you possibly can for your event, and you have ticked as many boxes as you can, and then if somebody contracts the disease, and a week later they get ill, I'm not sure it's going to be very easy to be able to prove that it actually happened at that event. If you've implemented all of your, as an organizer, if you've done everything, and I did see one of the messages popped up that, will insurers require more granular information? Look, I am an absolute advocate. The more information I can get my hands on to assess a risk, happy days. One of the issues I think generally in this particular part of the insurance market is that underwriting discipline kind of has disappeared in certain elements. And I think this is an opportunity to reinforce that. And those companies that have actually implemented discipline will benefit. And look, it goes back to event management planning. It goes back to talking to the government and the agencies and health and safety. And if you can tick all of those boxes and the event can go ahead, I'll take the risk on. We don't have an exclusion for sort of liability for events at the moment at Chubb. We don't have one, unless it's going to be, I don't know, 25 people playing chess or 100 people playing chess in a tiny little room. Yeah, we might pop an exclusion clause on that. But if it's an outdoor event at the moment, and they want some GL cover, and the event can go ahead, and they've complied with all of the necessary health and safety laws, and the government is okay, and they're issuing permits, then we'll do it. I think you're right though, Chris. Nash, I think it is going to open the door. These more litigious countries, there's going to, people will see it as an opportunity to make some claims. I don't think it'll ever be. It won't be an asbestos type situation, or it won't be a systemic kind of thing. I don't think. I don't know. Maybe it will. I don't know.
Yeah. Well, I think it's as you said. It's really difficult to prove that was the one place that you got it, and then the next part of that is then proving negligence for most of the jurisdictions that we work in. So, as you say, if you've followed all of the known health guidelines, where is the negligence? And I would hope that the majority of courts in jurisdictions would support that. But we've been surprised before.
Yeah.
And as the event organiser, that's where you want to transfer your risk, is to the insurer, so that as the organiser, you don't have to worry about that. You let someone else do it.
Great point. Can we maybe just switch gears a little bit to, so what's happening all over the world is virtual races are popping up as replacements, substitutes, and in some instances they're going to maybe become part of the fabric, where they become part of the journey, where you have the virtual event culminating in a year's time. Let's assume we're back to some kind of normal. What's the position in terms of a virtual event? What cover should be taken? Is cover required? My sense is that probably a lot of organisations are putting these events on without any kind of cover or extension to their policy. What's the opinion of the panel? Maybe start with you, Jack.
My feeling is this goes back to the assumed risk. I would make sure that the participants are signing a waiver similar to what I've seen when you go to a health club, that if something happens, it's really your issue. We can't, I don't know how, I couldn't write insurance for something that I have no idea what course they're running. I mean, it could be on a treadmill, or it could be in a pool. I don't know how you write. I'm curious to hear if somebody says there is insurance that can cover an event that is virtual. Your homeowner's insurance would cover it if you're running on a treadmill in your house, I guess.
Yeah, that's right.
Health insurance.
Yeah.
I
think there's obviously with the virtual event, Chris, there's a much greater assumption of risk by the participant than there is in an event you turn up to and get told where to go and where to stand and where the start will be, and where you're not given the level of instruction. I think the virtual event is actually, from an insurer's point of view, my feeling at the moment from the ones that I've seen, is actually a much better risk to be insuring, because the likelihood of something coming from it, from what I've seen happening here in Australia, is far less than what I would expect to see from a normal participation event, and whether that be marathon, obstacle event, whatever it may be, because you've I guess, as Jack says, if there's some sort of waiver, or just even the voluntary assumption that you've set out your own course, you've worked out where to go, then it is what it is.
All right, thanks for that. Let's we're getting close to wrap up time. I've just popped a poll in there just to get a sense of people's expectations on premium. So let that just run a while I jump into a couple of the questions. Dermot, you, not so much a question, your comment that Sweden appeared to accept that there were shortcomings in their plan not to lock down, and I saw that story as well, that they claimed that maybe too many lives got lost in the end. But again, it's going to be interesting to some of the comments, not for one moment demeaning any life, but if we look back in a year's time and see, how many people, were lost through suicide and what impact on the economy, you might well be looking back and saying they made the right decision. But, that's obviously hard to judge right now. I think we've answered Louise's question. Dave Budge, would an event organizer be liable if a participant caught COVID through community contact at an event? So I guess you're assuming someone participates, there's spectators on the sideline. Is that maybe what you're alluding to there, Dave? And what's the sense around that? So I've come, it's not so much on the race course of the marathon, but I mean, again, you made the point of how do you prove that? How do you even prove that they've contacted it at the event?
Yeah, so I
Proof.
don't think there's an answer to that at this stage. We will wait for the cases to be tried on and whether a precedent will be set. At the moment, we can't honestly say it'll definitely go one way or the other.
Yeah, thank you. Michael Eisner came and just said, Jack, attorneys feel that event will still need to defend themselves if participants get hurt during a virtual event. That's an interesting one. Maybe that's Michael's based in Chicago, if I'm right, so maybe that's a...
Well, quickly, I was just going to answer, Michael, but it really gets down to, you can do all the coverage you want, but you can't cover negligence. And if an attorney, and I live in a country that's full of attorneys that will do anything for a case, I'm sure you can find one that will claim you were negligent. And you can't waive negligence. All the waivers in the world can waive. And so
yeah,
I'll be interested to see what the first virtual event lawsuit looks like, but I'm sure it'll happen.
There's going to be one, yeah.
Very cynical, very sad, but true.
And how do you sit there, and Stuart, in that? So you protect people for their entry fees. Does that cover virtual events? I sign up for a virtual event, it gets cancelled. I pull my hamstring on the treadmill the day before I'm supposed to run 20 kilometers on my treadmill around the back, and I can claim my entry fee back?
Yeah, the participant protection is purely if the participant can't get involved. So we'd cover a virtual event exactly the same as we'd cover a normal event. If they can't run for a reason which is protected, we'll refund them. But for a virtual event itself, I think I'm with Jack. I think it's a challenge. Certainly, if someone wants to come and speak to us about it, we'll definitely look at it with our event cancellation protection.
Great, thanks. Just a couple more. We're pretty close to time, so I'll do a quick wrap up in a moment. But Mark Denny, is it time for event organisers to be clearer with their cancellation T's and C's to incentivise entries by confirming that if cancelled, the consumer will get their actual money back within X days into their account as opposed to postponements or vouchers? Look, absolutely. I think, Mark, the reality that's been touched on and that COVID's exposed is that most of the industry is working on a broken business model, and I think that that's part of the challenge that's really been exposed here. There needs to be a re-engineering of that business model. What's the answer? Is it more government involvement? Is it is it better engagement of sponsors? My sense is that maybe it's not going to be sponsors that are going to come riding in on the white horse and rescue people here, and particularly the way that some of the sponsorships are sold in the industry. But clearly, there's going to have to be some evolution of the model. And those people that have done the right thing now have been in a position to be able to do the right thing in terms of giving full refunds and so on, are going to be the people that are likely to sustain. But even some of the big organizations have had to come up with creative ways of managing the impact of refunds on their cash flows and so on. So it's definitely, in my opinion, people that can put that confidence in place are gonna have a better chance of people returning. And maybe let's just flick across to Ant Bliss. Mass participation races are essentially marketing and advertising channels and demographic profile creators. The entry fees only barely cover the cost of the event. Advertising, sponsorship, and demographic data intelligence for brands to target is where the long-term income streams are generated for an event owner. Agree. Being much more aware of the demographic, the data, and being able to show that to sponsors with good analysis of that is certainly one of the ways forward. But again, the question mark here is, what a new business model is going to be like. Just share the results of the poll here. The bulk of people think that entry fees are insurance premiums are going to go up by more than 20% and above. So 29%. Let me just share those in the window there. So increased entry fees, increased venue hires, and increased medical costs and so on. We've got a business model that's going to be under challenge, and there's going to need to be some creativity to create a more robust business. I think these are the discussions that have been going for a significant amount of time. Folks, we're pretty much out of time, so I'm just going to go through a quick summary. Great conversation, I feel. I think the key, as in all of this, it's been repeated many times in different forums. it's the world has changed. It's going to be different. New plans, as Chris alluded to. It's not just a plan to overcome COVID. There might be a second wave, there might be a third wave, but the plans that you make now have to be created in such a way that they're here in the long term. Partnership is key. Get around the table, sit down, have a conversation, share detailed plans as granular as possible. Frankie's comment there, the more information he can get, the more likely he is going to be that he's going to underwrite the risk. Government is probably going to be crucial in terms of supporting this. Pandemic cover may be available, but almost certainly cost prohibitive. Communicable disease in that space as well. Private property potentially presents opportunities, but it doesn't abdicate the responsibility for duty of care, but maybe a better opportunity of, rather than negotiating with a firm government agency, offer to be negotiating with an insurer that's going to be able to provide some form of cover. Again, repeated a couple of times, tripartite, talk to the event organizer, get round, the most subjective class of insurance. So again, the onus is on the people in the industry to put the plans, to convince the underwriter in the industry that they're in a position to be able to be insured. The discussion about the blood rule, so the comparison with what happened with HIV, undoubtedly there's going to be protocols that are going to have to be in place long term. And virtual events, I don't think we got completely to what the answer is. Some feeling that there's an onus. The onus is on the participant doing it in their home, but the sense that in America people are nervous about what they're exposing them to. Eric Gottschalk's just popped up a question: is there going to be a new definition of reasonable in TNC? Yeah, possibly. Good question. Yeah, interesting comment. Folks, I think it's now 3 minutes past. I think we're done on time. I just would like to thank again our panelists for their insights in the conversation. Thank you, Frankie, Stuart, Chris, and Jack. A reminder, next week we're going to be talking about registration platforms. Monday, the strength in numbers, 4:30 p.m., just one session next week. If there's anything I can help you with, please feel free to email me directly, chris@chrisrobb.asia. Big thank you to all of you that have tuned in from around the world. Thanks so much again to our panelists. Appreciate your time and your insights. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Chris. Thanks, guys.
Chris, Frankie, Stuart, Jack.
Thanks a lot, guys.
Thanks very much, everyone.